We know there's a similar experiment that has been done with chacma baboons, where they simulated a breakup between a consort pair, so the male and the female always together. And they simulated a situation where they played her grunts from the one side and his grunts of that consort pair from the other side to another baboon. And the baboon was like, what? Yeah. So super surprised, checking out the situation, going to where the female apparently was and stuff like this.
Hello everyone and welcome back to the Neuroscience and Beyond podcast. I'm Svilin, a molecular and cellular neuroscience PhD student at the University Medical Center Göttingen in Germany. Alongside my team of incredible graduate students, we are on a quest to bring science, and especially neuroscience, closer to the general public. Today, we're excited to welcome Professor Julia Fischer, who is head of the Cognitive Ethology lab at the German Primate Center, and also professor at the University of Göttingen in Germany. Her lab studies the evolution of communication, cognition, and social behavior in primates, exploring selective pressures and evolutionary constraints. To do this, Professor Fischer and her team are mainly conducting field studies in Africa, where they engage with many non-human primates in their natural habitat on a daily basis. Tune in to explore the fascinating world of non-human primates. We will talk about their ways of communication, social structures, and cognition, but also we will discuss their incredible similarities to us humans, alongside with many more exciting topics. Before we begin, I'd like to mention that this podcast is a separate activity from my position at the University Medical Center Göttingen in Germany. This podcast is supported by the International Max Planck Research School for Neurosciences, as well as the Cluster of Excellence Multiscale Bioimaging in Göttingen. If you also want to support us, please subscribe to our channel and do not hesitate to drop us a comment under our videos. And now, dear listeners, please enjoy the talk with Professor Julia Fischer. Hello, Professor Fischer. Thank you for your time, and I'm happy that we have you here at our podcast.
I'm very happy to be here. I think it's a great initiative.
So, usually I'm struggling always. I'm learning how to do a podcast, and always the beginning is hard for me, like greeting the person in front of me. You are a non-human primate specialist. I wanted to ask you, do monkeys actually greet each other?
Oh, absolutely, yes. It depends on the species, but the ones that I study now, baboons, especially guinea baboons, they greet each other by grunting when they approach one another. So they go like, And that's kind of a signal of benign intent. That's a friendly, affiliative. Other species, like the Barbary macaques that I also study, they do more with their faces. They lip smack, and so that's also affiliative. But the baboons, they have the snout. So lip smacking also occurs, but it's less visible than in macaques. So grunting plays a huge role.
This is a part of their communication, which we are going to hear a little bit later more about, right?
Yeah. So,
Yes, yeah, exactly. When I asked you or invited you to come to our podcast, you mentioned that you came back from a field study in Botswana?
No, Senegal.
Senegal, sorry. Maybe you can tell us about actually the focus of your research.
Yeah, so as I already mentioned, I am a baboon researcher, and I find baboons really very interesting because there are different species that live in different types of societies. And when in my first postdoc that I did in Botswana, so there's the Botswana link, I studied chacma baboons, and they're, as we called them, the cool bullies of the savannah, so very aggressive, despotic. The females cling to one another, especially the related females, so they have these matrilines, but they're also hierarchical. And so I did studies on their communication and also how infants learn to understand the signals of their population. And then when I started here in Göttingen, I thought, okay, what are we going to do now? And I looked at the map of Africa and the different species, and we noticed that we really knew very little about the baboons in West Africa. And there are two species, guinea baboons, they're in the west-west, the westernmost baboon, if you will. And there was hardly anything known about them. And what was known, people had different opinions how they were. And I thought, okay, let's go there and check it out. And so we set up a field site 15 years ago now. And so then, that was a huge endeavor to start a project from scratch. We do it together with Senegalese partners. It's in a national park. So then you have to set up the infrastructure and find people and then get the guinea baboons to accept you. So it took us 3 years of following them until they accepted us and did not notice us anymore so much. And we didn't know how interesting they really were. And what we found out now through this research over the years is that they're completely different from the Chacma baboons. Their males have friendships. The females are not so interested in one another. The males stay, they're philopatric, they stay in the group where they were born. And the females disperse, so they leave the male or they leave the natal group. And they have what we call a multi-level system. So at the basis, you have a male with the females and the offspring. And then there are several males who are friends. So they stick together. We call this a party. That's kind of the social group they have. And then a party can be affiliated with another party. And then that's a gang. And then several gangs can come together. And so sometimes you're surrounded by 400 baboons. And they're super spatially tolerant and socially tolerant. They're mostly affiliative. And then there's a lot of greeting among the males. So they have not only the grunts, but the males have these super elaborate, weird greeting rituals where they hip touch and shake the head. They do this kind of head banging thing. And then they get up and touch each other's genitals. So this is what we call a bond testing. And so now we have sort of established the variation in the social system. We have a good understanding of the social system of the guinea baboons, how they mate. So females choose a male and then they mate mostly with him, like 98%. So paternity certainty is very high. And the males actually invest in the infants. There's care for infants. And even if the mother leaves or dies, then you will see the dad or other males in this unit, the younger males taking care of the infant. And now we can look at what are the consequences in terms of communication, in terms of the cognition. So what do they know about one another? We can look at the value of social relationships. We know this from other baboon species, that for the females, we know for the females that if you have a good social network, you're healthier, you live longer, you have more offspring surviving. And now we can look at this from the male side. Do we see similar effects in our guys? And so, yeah, there is a whole range of questions that we can address.
It's fascinating, and I have a whole range of questions that I would like to ask you regarding all of this that you have said. Maybe we can start by saying, how do you actually study the behavior or cognition in the free land of monkeys? Do you have some tools? Do you follow them, as you said? Do you use cameras or something like drones or some other techniques for following them, for example?
Yeah, so I mean, at the center is still the observation by a human person that follows them. We have handheld devices, we have programs, we have a super structured way in which we code the data. We have a manual that is about that thick, that anybody who comes and works with us, they have to understand the rules, and there's a lot of training. So first you have to ID everybody. That's the foundation, because we need to know who does what to whom. So for the adults, that's quite simple, but for the juveniles, it's kind of hellish because they all look alike. And some people are very talented. They take 2 weeks and they know everybody, and others go, on and on and on. I'm more on the slow side, but so I'm sympathetic when it takes a little bit longer. But and then they go through this training program, and we do a lot of observer reliability. So people have to pass these reliability tests before they can start collecting data independently. And so that's the core. And so we track, okay, who grooms whom? So they have this social grooming, who grooms whom, who approaches whom, who leaves whom, who aggresses whom. So with all these data, we can construct rank hierarchies, we can construct the social network, who's affiliated with whom. We can look at, for instance, maternal care, how much nursing do they provide, when do they stop weaning the infant. So for all of this, you need these observational data. But we also do playback experiments. So if you want to know how they respond to calls or what they know about one another, you can do these. You can stage social scenes basically using the playback of sounds. So you can play back an interaction between two other animals, and that interaction can either be consistent with what's going on in their society, or it can be inconsistent. So you can have something like a female is communicating, grunting to another male, and that's the male she's actually with, so that would be consistent. Or it could be a completely different male. And then the question is anyone who hears this surprised? So do they detect these deviations? And we know from the chacma baboons, they're super sensitive. So if anything is a little bit different from what it should be, they're all like, what's going on? Because it could have consequences for them. And the guinea baboons, they're kind of more interested in what they already know. They kind of have this confirmation bias. We don't really understand why, but perhaps because these animals are really gregarious. And so you see a lot of deviation. Yeah. So the statistical patterns of what can co-occur or not are probably different, or we know they're different from the chacmas, for instance. And so we do playbacks, observations. Then we have camera traps. And the camera traps, we are working on a system to recognize them individually from photos. So we can do social networks from the photos, but that's much more difficult than we thought. I was really optimistic that after 3 years or so we would have a system in place, but no, it's super data hungry. So you basically need to train the models with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of photos, and we don't have these photos. And then you have new baboons coming in because the system is so chaotic. It's not so great. But on the other hand, the camera traps help us to estimate the predator density. So we see, how many lions have been in the area, how many leopards have been around, and so on. So that helps us to understand their ranging patterns, where they're hanging out, and so it gives us really important information. Then we tried drones. We thought it would be so cool, to have a view from the top and then see how everybody is moving. And the baboons hated the drone. And they basically spent all day under a tree. So some juveniles sort of peeked out, but they hated it so much. And I thought, we're not going to do it. And of course, the other problem is you need to do ground truthing. Yeah? So for us, it's really always important to know who's who. And so the drone from the top, everybody really looks alike. And then how do you do the ground truthing? And so then we decided, okay, it's not worth it to try that.
And I assume you have quite a lot of contacts with the primates, right? In personal kind of, you encounter them or you observe them from kind of a distance. How does it work?
Initially we observed them from a distance, but then the more habituated they get, you walk with them.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And so they're so habituated now, like this time when I was there in the morning. So you can imagine they sleep in sleeping trees. So in the morning you get up really early, it's still dark. And then you go to the sleeping tree, or sometimes when it's farther away, you drive to the sleeping trees when you know when they are. They have collars, radio collars, and we have antennas. So this way we can sort of locate them because it's unpredictable where they're sleeping. So in the morning you start actually with a location, then you go to the sleeping tree. They're still up in the sleeping tree. It's still dark. And then you hear, the and they're greeting each other, they're slowly waking up, and then they come down. And when I was there in January, it's kind of cold at night. And then they bask in the sun. So they sit by the river and they wait for the sun to come up. And so I stood there watching them, and then I noticed that one baboon tail was over my shoe. So that's how close they get.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so we now really have to be careful that we don't step on them.
Aren't you afraid, actually, or?
No.
Because they're quite big, the baboons,
they're
right?
Yeah, and they have really impressive canines.
Yes.
Yeah. The males, you don't want to be aggressed by a male. And they can become very defensive. So there's one male, Zepp, he was really watching out whether we would come too close to any one of his infants. And he could become vicious, and then they slap you and or even bite sometimes, or try to bite. So you do have to be careful. And I prefer it. And I told also my team, it's like, we have to make sure that they respect us also. So we don't want them to come too close. We don't want them to hug us. But it's kind of, you cannot control it. So we had this one male, Vader, and he started greeting people. So not only grunting, but they also have this tail flick. Yeah, so this is what the males do when they walk by one another. Then they flick the tail. And he started doing this with the researchers. Yeah? So you cannot tell him, like, don't do this. But still, I said, the way we walk has to be, on the one hand, inconspicuous. But if somebody comes too close, you have to be dominant so that they don't even think about touching you. And so it's subtle, yeah. But I prefer that they don't come too close. Yeah?
So you have to establish some kind of rules so that they're also aware, probably, or not. I don't know.
No, they are very aware. I mean, if one thing baboons are really good at is watching others.
Okay.
Yeah, they watch each other all the time. I wish we could hire them as baboon observers. We would have really, really good data. But they can't operate the devices, no. But they're also really good at watching us. And so the more predictable you are, the more they ignore you. Yeah. So, and what they hate, for instance, if you trip. Now, of course, you can't help it. Sometimes you do trip, yeah, but they don't like that.
So this is maybe the part of the metacognition concepts. Do they realize what we that we also have our own intentions, or I might get wrong the concept. Yeah. I don't know.
No, I think they basically operate on just observing.
Yeah,
and they prefer if they can predict your way of walking, if they can predict what you're going to do next, so then they can adjust. I don't think they are worried about what you're thinking. They're worried about what you're doing, or they are interested in what you're doing. And so body language becomes really important, and respecting spatial distances. Also, for instance, when you follow a baboon, I always try to walk next to them. So they know me, they see me without looking at me. So but if you're walking behind them, you can see that they're turning the head, and then that's already disrupting. So that's what you have to learn, is like, how do I move around that to not impose myself on them and not distract them. But it's really amazing. Now they know each other, they know us all individually, yeah. And of course, so when a new person comes, they're a bit more wary, yeah. So they check that person out, and they need to get adjusted. But even me, although I'm only going there for a few weeks per year, I belong to the group, and I'm accepted. And nobody, some of the of course, like a 2-year-old, hasn't maybe remembered me, or a 1-year-old doesn't know me. But then they check you out, and then it's okay, and they remember you, and then you're part of the pack. On the other hand, I think they don't miss us. So COVID, we had to close the field site. We had to evacuate everybody and bring them back to Europe and the US and wherever people came from. And we were all wondering, it's like, if the baboons noticed that we were no longer. But when we came back after 7 months, there was no reunion. There was no like, oh, there you are, or anything. We were just back.
Yeah. Maybe this is their kind of way to say, hey, you're here, but who cares? Or I don't know.
It's a bit who cares. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting. So you mentioned that there is a difference in the cultures of the species, these baboons and the others. And what is from the evolutionary perspective? Maybe can you comment, why are these differences there?
Yeah, that's the $1 million question. I need a time machine to answer it with empirical data. Yeah. So we don't know what happened, but a fact is the following. So if you look at the baboon phylogeny, there are 2 clades, the northern and the southern clade. And the southern clade are the more aggressive, more despotic baboons. Although there's also considerable variation. So these are yellow baboons. Kinder baboons aren't really so aggressive. They are weird. They have sort of kind of juvenile features, and the infants are sometimes often white. So something weird happened. And then you have the chacma baboons, who are massive and really quite aggressive. And then you have the northern clade, that's olive baboons, and hamadryas in Guinea. And at the base of that northern clade, something happened. So there you already start seeing in the olive baboons that males and females tend to bond more, also outside the mating season. So in the other baboons, you would have a female, she's sexually receptive, and then a baboon the alpha baboon, so this is what happens in Guinea, in Chacma baboons. So then the alpha male usurps the female. So he will just follow her and make sure he's the only one who gets to mate with her. And so there's mate guarding, and they don't eat, and they're just following the female because that's the thing now. And in the olive baboon, you can also already see, although they're still female bonded and males dispersed, that you still have these long-term relationships between males and females. So you start seeing this pair bonding kind of system. And then that, I think, became fixed in hamadryas and Guinea baboons. And that creates a certain dynamic, because once males have these long-term relationship with females, then it's more profitable for the male to really invest in the female, and then the female has to leave at some point. So then you have an incentive, if you will, for evolution or selection pressures on females leaving at some point. When the male dies, for instance, they have to switch. And then you can see basically the whole pattern turns around. So now males have the opportunity to bond. Males stay put. They become more related to one another. So that's what we see in the Guinea baboons. So the other guy could be your brother or your half-brother, cousin, whatever. So there is increasing relatedness among the males. Then they become more tolerant because you don't want to fight with your brother. It's not worth it, And the females become sort of aloof and not so obsessed about the infants because at some point they need to leave anyway. So it's kind of a precondition. You now get selection for females that are a bit more laissez-faire. And we see this in the mothers. So there are a few mothers that are super protective. The mothers are kind of, the infant comes, okay, it goes, okay. And in the Chacmas, we had much more variation. So there we had these super possessive mothers. They were totally protective and then sort of holding on to the infant, and the infant was screaming because it wanted to get away, but the mother held on to it at the tail, But you also had rejective mothers that would drag the infant off the back. So at some point the infant actually moves from when they carry them initially, it's at the ventrum, at the tummy. And when the infant gets a bit older, then it wants to climb onto the back and sort of, ride like a jockey. And then I saw mothers dragging the infant off. So there's huge variation there. And in the Guinea baboon mothers, they're kind of all easy.
Do you know how this behavior of the mother influences the child's upbringing, for example?
Yeah, we looked into this. We had a large sample, but sort of scarce. There were 80 infants over 18 months, sort of how is there variation in survival probability or growth. So we actually had this, here's another method we used, is parallel laser photogrammetry. So you have a camera with 2 laser beams, and then you project the laser beams onto the animal, and they're 4 centimeters apart, and then you can do the math and calculate the growth. The error is quite considerable. I think we have just now completed a study on assessing the error of different methods, how to assess growth. But we still didn't find any variation. I think with this large sample size of the infants, we should have seen variation if there was one. But there was no change in growth, whether or not the mothers did more or less, allowed more nursing or more carrying. But overall, the variation between the mothers was relatively small.
That's interesting. But if this part does not play a role, perhaps the cultural setup would play a role in the upbringing, also the communication within these groups. Is this the case?
Well, I wouldn't call it culture, because culture is is learned. And it's also symbolic, and it is full of artifacts and conventions, and So that, I think, what makes a culture specific. But it's really species-specific behavior. It's innate. So there are innate differences. There are innate behavioral dispositions. And then, of course, I would, then there's also learning also plays a role. So if you have Hans Kummer, he was a pioneer of the baboon in the field of baboon research. He studied Hamadryas baboons in the 1950s, 1960s. So he was the first. He got himself a Volkswagen bus, and then they drove to Ethiopia and looked. And there's a hybridization zone between the Hamadryas baboons and the yellow baboons. And then he did some translocation experiments. So he caught a yellow baboon female who was used to kind of live independently and put her with the Hamadryas baboons, and the Hamadryas baboons males are the females have to submit. There's a lot of herding, neck biting, aggression against the females. And the yellow baboon females, they learn to submit. They learn to do what the male wanted them to do, in quotation marks. There's also, actually, there are observations from Saudi Arabia, where the Hamadryas baboons also live, where the baboons, they raise puppies from dogs. So they catch puppies or take them, and then they raise them like their females. So the puppies submit wow. and follow the baboon. Because they know if they don't follow, they get bitten. And so they are conditioned to follow them. And then when they're grown up, they protect the herd. So they're raised to become guards. And it's a win-win situation at some point, because if you are hanging out with 80 baboons, they also protect you. So the dogs also get an advantage. But to see this footage of, I haven't been there, but to see the footage of the baboons dealing with the puppies is quite amazing. But coming back to so it's innate disposition. So the males certainly have this innate disposition to be aggressive, but then the females learn to submit. And vice versa, the Hamadryas baboon females that were translocated to the yellow baboon community, where they can enjoy a much more pleasurable life. Well, it took them, a few days, and then they were like, "This is great! I can do what I want."
That's very interesting.
So you see these two things, and in the guinea baboons, we study only one population, but there is an Emineuter group leader here at the DPZ, Liran Samuni. She studies chimps in Guinea, but there are also guinea baboons there, and she has loads of video footage, and they behave exactly the same way, what we can see, like ours. And then we have also genetic data. So a former PhD student of our group, Gisela Kopp, she traveled all around West Africa and collected poop samples, and then she looked at the haplotype distribution, so she could tell whether it was a male or a female poop, and then she could see that the female haplotypes are everywhere more structured, so there's more a signal of distance compared to... No, it's the other way around. For the males, there's a greater signal of distance than for the females. And that tells us that the males stay put and the females transfer. They're responsible for the gene flow everywhere. So that gives us some indirect indication wherever you look. It's probably a very similar system.
This is yet another tool that how can you study, right?
Yeah, and we do also hormones.
Yeah.
So from the poop samples, you can extract metabolites that tell you something about testosterone or glucocorticoids, so stress levels, or also female sex hormones, so ovulation, progesterone, estrogen, etc.
That's very interesting and nice when you combine the data with the footage and also the behavior aspect, and then you can really, really draw a solid conclusion, right? I just wanted to go back to this story with the dog. Why in first place there was dog in the monkey herd, so to say? Did they try something? Do you know? Was this an experiment, or it happened that there was a puppy and they raised it? And because I'm thinking, how do the primates, these non-human primates, would know? Okay, if I raise now this dog, it will kind of protect us in the future, right? This is interesting.
I would think it was kind of initially a freak accident. So basically, a puppy is similar enough to a young baboon. Yeah. So then they have this inclination, take it. Yeah. Because they take infants and carry them around. And so these baboons lived near humans anyway. So that they were basically raiding trash heaps. Yeah. So that's why there were dogs, because that was near human settlements. So there were stray dogs, but still, and then they got the hang of it. They learned how it worked, and then they became maybe more systematic. But it's just, as far as I know, it's just one population who does that.
Yeah.
So you can have a random thing happening, and then they learn from it.
Yeah. It's very interesting that also probably the dog had to learn how to kind of communicate with these monkeys, right? And speaking of communication, how do these non-human primates communicate with each other?
Oh,
besides the grunts.
In multiple ways.
Ways, yeah.
So they have vocalizations, and again, what's interesting for the baboons is, I told you all about how different the societies are. But if you do the recordings and do fancy acoustic analysis, the calls are all the same. So you can tell the difference because the Chacma baboons are larger. So when a Chacma baboon grunts, it's like, and the guinea baboon male is, So, you can tell the difference from the size. But if you control for size, basically all the variation disappears. The vocalizations mainly are really, the structure is extremely similar, and they would all understand each other. So you can do a playback, and you can play an alarm call of a Chacma baboon that lives, 6,000 kilometers away or 10,000 kilometers away, and they would understand each other. They would know this is an alarm call. Having said that, what differs is how often they use calls like this. So, for instance, the Chacma baboons being so competitive, they have calls to signal their stamina, to signal their fighting ability. So they use the loud bark, which is also the alarm call, and just call and call and call and call. And these calls vary with rank. So they give you a good indication of how fit a baboon is, what its resource holding potential is. And the guinea baboon males don't do that. They don't need to display because they have a completely different strategy where they're nice to females and try to have a little, their females to themselves. So there's no displaying. Interestingly, there is also the roar grunt, which is sort of a very elaborate, and then they inhale and sort of pump themselves up, and they do both the guinea and the Chacma baboon males do that, this roar grunt. Sounds more impressive than when I do it. Yeah. So it sounds really impressive. They're signaling size probably. And then the Chacma baboons would start wahooing, doing this display. And the guinea baboon males are just silent, And initially I was always like, no, start wahooing, why? But they don't. So the structure of the signals is the same, but the usage differs. And then they have, of course, in addition to the acoustic communication, they have facial expressions. So the threat stare is very important. They have light eyelids. So although the faces are dark, the eyelids are light so that you can flash. So when they raise the eyebrows, which is what we also do, but we have sort of the subtle eyebrow rise is actually friendly. But if you really raise it, this is kind of a threat stare. And this is primate. This is why, we are primates. And in the guinea baboon, or in the baboons generally, or also in the macaques, they all have this eyebrow rise, which is, if it's just rising, it's sort of a mild threat. But then if they also bob the head, then it becomes a more severe threat. And then they can add a vocalization, so they can sort of escalate the degree of threatening. Can combine signals, facial and acoustic. Then they have gestures, postures. These greeting rituals also combine postures, facial expressions, and vocalizations. Olfaction plays a minor role, I think. So they may sniff the genitals of the females to see whether she's receptive, but that's not so huge. So it's visual communication plays a huge role, and then acoustic communication.
When you study the acoustic communication, this kind of vocalizations, what kind of conclusion, or can you draw conclusions about the evolution of speech, that, for example, how it developed in human primates?
Yeah, I mean, that's been like, what I did for my PhD and my early postdoc years. I was really interested in that question. Can we understand the evolution of speech by studying monkeys? And I don't think we can. But what we know now, after studying their communication, we know now how different it is. We see some similarities, of course, the emotion expression, but that's more continuity. So we have emotion expression. Of course, we have also body postures, and we can tell if you know somebody really well. They pick up the phone, they say hello, and then you can say, like, "What's wrong?" So we can pick up these subtle differences, and that's the same, I think. And they know, they can assess the state of somebody else by their vocalizations, of course. So there's the continuity in the affective expression, and then there's continuity also in the sense that they can understand that if this animal makes this kind of sound, then this probably has happened. So they can draw these inferences. So the recipients are quite smart. Yeah, they can make all these inferences, so they know, okay, we're near a river, and then there's this bark, so that means probably there's a crocodile. Yeah, so they can put all these things together: context, ID, so who's calling, and then what is the expression. And there have been some ingenious experiments about reliability. So they played false alarms, of a specific animal that was continuing to produce, but that was a playback. And then they just started ignoring. So they seemed, okay, this guy has a bad day today. I can ignore what he's saying. So they factor in all this information. That's what they're really good at. But if you look at the expression, there's so little vocal learning. So what we see, we did a very fine analysis of looking at the fine structure of the calls. And so males that hang out together a lot, they sound a little bit more similar to one another than males of the other groups. But it's super subtle. And we don't even know if they pick up the differences. I mean, they could. It's in the range of what we know from psychophysics. They could pick up but whether they do, we don't know.
Can we refer to this as a slang or some dialect?
Yeah, accent. Yeah, I would say it's an accent. Yeah.
That's very interesting. Actually, is this how did it develop? Because of the learning, so they hear this and they kind of learn to produce this kind of behavior?
That's a good question. I mean, ultimately, you need neuroscientists to address these questions. There are some ideas about sensory motor integration, that if you keep perceiving a certain pattern, that activates the representation of the according motor pattern. So you're more likely to produce that pattern. And we see this in humans all the time, and it can be volitional, but it does not need to be volitional. So that you start talking more slowly if you're talking to somebody else who's also talking more slowly. And, so there are also these involuntary feedback loops in our sensory motor integration. And so I think that's a good model to look at, but how would you test it empirically? I have no idea, because then you're already talking about networks that are driving the vocal behavior, and we have some ideas of how it works, but the fine details, no. Yeah.
So you study the communication quite long, and also the social organization. And do you also study cognition? And how do you do it? Do you do it in the free, so in the wildness, or also studied it here in DPZ, the German Primate Center.
We study the cognition in the wild, and we're starting to study the cognition of guinea baboons actually in the zoo also. But that's where, it's now the phase of training and getting the animals accustomed to take part in experiments and do two-choice tests and stuff like this. So that's more something we're starting. But in the wild, we have done different kinds of experiments. So I already talked about playback experiments. So that basically taps into their social cognition. If you ask them, okay, do you know where your women are? So we had this one experiment where a male and a female were together, and then she walked to the one side. And now we have this wonderful speaker that operates with a little Wi-Fi that we are creating in our backpack. And you don't need a cable anymore, which makes a big difference when you're working in the field. So then you place the speaker either in the direction where she actually just disappeared, or you go to the other side and place it there. So she cannot be there. Yeah? And then you play her grunting. So is the male surprised now? Because, it's like, what's going on? Yeah. So I thought you went that way. Why is she now on the other side? They were not surprised. They were generally interested, no matter where the call came from. They were like, "Oh, where is Emma? Or what is she doing?" But they were not responding more strongly. So that's typical. I mean, the guinea baboons are kind of always so laissez-faire. I'm sure if you would do the same thing. I mean, we know there's a similar experiment that has been done with chacma baboons. Where they simulated a breakup between a consort pair, so the male and the female always together, and they simulated a situation where they played her grunts from the one side and his grunts of that consort pair from the other side to another baboon, and the baboon was like, what? Yeah. So super surprised, checking out the situation, going to where the female apparently was and stuff like this. So, so you can really tap into not only what they know, but so you can tap into what they know, but what matters to them. And for us, it seems the guinea baboon males, they don't need to control the females. So they're interested, yes, but they're not controlling in that sense, because they can rely more or less. I don't know if that's in their minds. It doesn't have to be, but basically they know the female will just mate with them. If the female has chosen them, then okay, they don't need to compete or control her.
It's very interesting how the hierarchy, the setup influences their behavior and cognition. And I'm curious, this is a little bit the chicken and the egg problem, but what was the first, like their brain development or some kind of evolution, I don't know, pressure, or the setup, as I said, the social hierarchy? It's kind of, I don't know, can you distinguish this?
No. But I would assume that the costs of making the wrong decision, so the selective pressures are on what gets you to pass on your genes, So I think it could be both the dispositions that are under selection, but I think they already had the brains to basically follow what was going on. So on the other hand, I don't think that their life now is such more complex, so they are smarter or something. I don't think so. What really varies is what is important, what either harms you or gives you a benefit. And then that's adjusted. So essentially what is changed is not necessarily the brain size or the ability to represent, but what you pay attention to. That changes between different baboon species, I would say. It's more the value of social information, but not the content of the social information. And so we've done a couple of such playback experiments where we just, for instance, the first one we did was, do they distinguish between strangers and neighbors? So we assume they know the neighbors because they're, have overlapping territories. But what if somebody appears they've never heard before? And so Peter Machi, who did the PhD, who was the PhD student at that time, he went to another population and 50 kilometers apart and got recordings there, and then came back and played back these sounds. And then we had the control condition was the grunts from males of their own group. And we had predicted that they would respond strongly to the strangers and less strongly to the neighbors and not at all to the group members. And then we do these experiments blind. So Peter didn't know what was, which type of call he played back. And then when he unblinded, when he done all the analysis and unblinded, he found out they only looked when it was their own people. So they wanted to know what their friends did, but they didn't care neither about neighbors nor strangers.
That's very interesting. It's fascinating. I don't know. As I said, I have very little to do with this research, and it always fascinates me when I read some books or watch some TED Talks. Franz de Waal, maybe, Sapolsky has a very nice book about this, also more neuroscience, but he studied a lot of primates. And it's somehow interesting how we think that we're different, but when you study them, you see so many similarities to our behavior, or, for example, this kind of body language or social organizations, and it's kind of, I'm always fascinated by this fact, about the non-human primates. But this is one part of the cognition that you can study in the wild. What would you do now in here in more controlled experiment, for example, in the zoo?
Okay, before I start, I have to talk about another experiment we did, because I like that so much. It's a current PhD student, Will O'Hearn, and this is also in the wild, and he devised this apparatus where males can be trained to pull a lever to dispense peanuts. So it looks like a big bubblegum machine, not inserting money, but lever pulling. And then the trick was that it was not only a machine to generate food for yourself, but at the 10th lever pull, you would generate food for everybody. So there would be 2 kilos of peanuts dispersed, around the machine. And so the males that could do this were providers. They provided access to this bonanza. And we had a remote control, and so Will could control who was able to operate the dispenser. And it was for each group only one specialist. We created these specialists. And then we were interested what happened. Like, did the others change their social behavior towards the specialists? And we predicted that they would become more popular. So everybody would try to be friends with them and groom them more and so on. And that didn't happen. So what happened was that the females started defending the male more. So he became more valuable to them. And the females also became more aggressive to one another, so they really tried to establish their rank position with the male. So the top female really made sure she stayed the top female. She tried to drive her other females in the unit away, and so we had. It was really interesting how you can get it wrong, in terms of your predictions, but then you learn so much. How much more subtle. Even their social strategies are. So that was a really cool experiment. And then we tried another one that failed. But so then the idea was, okay, now we have more baboons that can operate these boxes, but we put 2 boxes together and they have to operate them at the same time to provide a lot of reward. And so we had more capable and less capable operators, and if 2 more capable ones work together, they got much more food out of it than if you worked with a less capable, and 2 less capable animals together got only just a little bit of food together, but some, so that they were still incentivized to operate the boxes. And we thought, okay, it would be really neat to see if they would figure out who's good and who's not so good, and then prefer, they try to recruit a capable partner and drive away a less capable partner. But we never got that far, because after the third trial, the baboons started to aggress us when there was no more food. So they started aggressing the researchers. And then I thought, no, okay, this is too dangerous. We don't do this. But we hope that we can take this experiment into captivity, where we have a little bit more control, where we can separate animals so they work. And then maybe on the one side you have a capable partner, and on the other side you have a less capable partner. And do they then prefer to work with a more capable partner? So it's more constrained. But we thought, I mean, if it had worked in the wild, it would have been, of course, super, super cool. But we wrote it up and submitted it to a journal, and it's still it's under revision now. But the initial reviews were really positive. They said, thank you for telling us how you failed, because failures are such an integral part, and the whole reasoning was good. You know, the experimental design was flawless, and as far as it ever can be, but they were super positive, and I was very happy that we were. I think it will. I mean, I do hope it will be accepted, but that there was appreciation for sharing our experience so that others can learn from it.
I think this is really remarkable and very nice, and it should be like this. And I would encourage more scientists to share their experiences, because you save time to many other people to try out this, right? Unfortunately, there is no incentive to submit this kind of a experiment that was not 100% successful, right? And this is something that is one of the aspects that we as young PhD students struggle a little bit to understand. Why is it the scientific environment created this way? And maybe we can touch upon this topic a little bit later. But would you say that there is a difference in their behavior when they are... So you pick up a certain baboon from the wild and from the zoo, and in terms of their behavior, do they have similar communication patterns, social behavior, or does it differ?
Yeah, we had a bachelor student looking at this. So we have the long-term data from the field, and he looked at it in the zoo, and he used the same protocol and the same. So he was trained exactly the same way. So he was reliable, and we found no differences.
No difference.
Interesting. Yeah, we had predicted there was maybe more affiliation because they don't have to walk so much, but basically the rates of engaging in social interactions, the rates of aggression were similar. That's not always the case, but at least for the population we look at in the zoo, and for our population, it was similar. Sometimes, there are also some reports that in the zoos they behave more. There's more social behavior because there's less searching for food.
I never thought about this. I would think that they were like, because they have less freedom, they would be less active or something like this, but it's exactly the opposite. Huh?
It can be, but it doesn't have to be. Sometimes also, for instance, of course, it depends on what you're looking at. And if you watch chimpanzees in a zoo, they all see each other all the time. So they don't need to communicate acoustically. And so some people who just study them in zoos thought, well, they're not communicating much acoustically, but then in the forest, they can't see each other. So they have to rely on acoustic communication all the time. So there's a lot more going on of grunting and pant-hooting and hooting. And, they have also this elaborate vocal repertoire. But this is how they keep in touch. And then it's acoustically. So that's, I think, plays a big role. There's of course the distance and also maybe calls for prey or predation. No alarm calls in the zoo normally, except the vet comes. Then there's a lot of
that's very interesting. Do you plan other experiments to do in the zoo setup?
So we have, right now we do some simple stuff only to sort of get them going, understand the experimental paradigm that they have to choose, to operate the touch screen, how does it work, so it's all kind of trivial what we're asking at the moment, but then we want to get at, so my dream is that we start with these observations in the wild, and then, of course, in the wild you have difficulties getting at the cognitive mechanism. So what is it really? So, and then take these questions into the lab and say, okay, now, for instance, think spatial cognition. Can they, when they have to operate in a maze with a finger, can they take cues? So can they predict where a reward will be if you give them a cue, and how far, can they, so how far can the distance be? Temporal or spatial? So this would be experiments that we would try to set up. So really have an integration of the field research with the lab research, so that we can always build on what we have observed in the wild, and then say, okay, but how do they do this, or how could they operate? What could be the cognitive mechanisms they employ actually?
And I assume you can also couple this kind of setup with cameras, so this would be more kind of time efficient maybe for analysis eventually. I don't know actually.
I mean, anyways, we film everything because often, well, you just needed to document your experiment. Yes. But then also depending on the task, latencies, are often informative. How long do they actually take to make a decision? And so this is kind of stuff we do.
Speaking about dreams, I would be keen on finding more about what do you want to find out about the baboons, for example. What is some burning question that you were like, I want to find this. This is kind of very, very interesting, and it will be beneficial to know this. What would be this kind of a topic or problem?
For me, it's really the co-evolution of these different traits. So if you would set up a computational model of a baboon society, and then you would start cranking one of the screws, what does it mean for the rest of the system? Yeah, I think we have a verbal model in our head, what is going on, how all these variables are affecting one another, and how the payoff matrices of different decisions change, both ontogenetically and over evolutionary times. If we could model this would be super interesting to test some of these hypotheses we have about the links between the different elements of the society, from disposition to affiliate to representation of your social environment. So I don't have this one thing that I want to find out. I want to find out what the whole thing is.
So you're more on the macro scale rather, because we are kind of prompt to think about, okay, we want to see this protein that does this and this. And you're more about the cognition.
Yeah, it's like ballooning, I started with, can they perceive a difference between call A and call B, and how do they deal with graded variation that are super subtle, and so now it's kind of, maybe that's the way you go with either age or experience, I don't know, or both. I think the differences between the societies and what it means to everything else. And then of course this is a feedback system, because when you behave differently, that affects the society. So how to understand these feedback dynamics between the unit, the individual that's behaving and processing information and signaling. So you have decision making, you have behavior control, motor planning, if you will, and perception and all of this. And how can we understand the feedback loops between the element and the whole thing?
This is very interesting, and I think it's very hard though.
Yeah.
It's very tough. We will have to have a little bit more patience perhaps to have the tools even to study this kind of concepts.
Yeah, it's not trivial, but if you one thing at a time, and I think we have made some progress. I think there are some ideas out there, for instance, about variation between species. And there's the dominant paradigm, I mean, for a long time has been the socio-ecological model. And it was proposed in the 1960s and then forever refined, it became more complex. So the basic idea is it's almost like Marxist, So how you sustain yourself will determine what matters to you, and das Sein bestimmt das Bewusstsein, So monkey or primate parlance, you would say the subsistence mode creates the type of society, the competition patterns, the bonding patterns, etc. And for the baboons, Dietmar Zinner, who also works in our group, he led this big comparative study where he looked at the habitat characteristics, food availability, precipitation, everything, and the social characteristics, and there's no correlation. So we could really rule out this idea that the socio-ecological model explains the variation between baboon societies. And I think that's a big step to really say, we know this is not the explanatory variable, so there's something else going on, and the question is, what is it? And so there are different ideas. One is that it had something to do with the range expansion, which is a big topic in evolutionary biology, is like how do range expansion of species or bacterial strains. So what happens at the edge? Because you have very specific evolutionary dynamics at the edge of a population. So that's one idea. Another is, and they're not necessarily mutually exclusive, is that it depends on the population density. So that if you are surrounded by hundreds and hundreds of baboons or thousands everywhere, baboons everywhere, it's not profitable for males to fight one another anymore. And that's my pet idea, is to say, okay, it's actually not so much the range expansion, it's more probably population density is an important kicker to the impulse, basically, to get this change in the system going.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Is there anything that you learn, I guess so, so you learn about human behavior from the non-human primates?
Yeah, I mean, of course. You do learn something about the importance of bonds, about friendships, and they, I mean, the guinea baboons are kind of endearing also, because the males have these super long-lasting friendships, and we have these two males, for instance. So as I already said, they have these collars, and so every now and then, every 2 or 3 years, depending on the battery life, you have to capture them and we dart them, and then you have to do this very repetitiously, so nobody can notice that you're touching somebody. So it's a big, it's stressful also, for them, for us also. And so we darted one of the males, and Cisco and Indy have been friends since 12 years now. So the first time we saw them, they were actually juveniles. Hanging out together, playing, and now they're big old males almost. So they're coming to the end of their reproductive time, and so we captured Cisco, and then everybody at some point, they walk away, they go about their daily business, but Indy was sitting there and watching, making sure that we wouldn't touch his body. And we had to lure him away with loads of peanuts. So then, the food, was more important than the friend. But it was still, I thought, this is interesting. I mean, there are some of these are anecdotal, but of course now, when we look at the data, we can look at this multiple times. But just to see these guys, it's like, you've been playing 12 years ago, you were rough and tumble playing, and now you sit here and you're watching your friend. And that's interesting to see how that matters. And we know this in ourselves. And at some point when you get older, you know that you cannot start an old friendship anymore. So the people you get to know while you're studying, or, I mean, I have one of my best friends, we know each other since kindergarten. So there's something that you establish that you cannot repeat it. You can still meet people, but you will not say, like, you remember when we were 20.
So this camaraderie bonding is also establishing in the species. It's not something unique to humans, let's put it that way, right? It's very interesting, very, very interesting. It's, I don't know, very, very interesting, But when you regarding friendship, also, this is, I guess, again, kind of dependent on the social structure architecture of the group. It's not like in every group there is this kind of thing. Yeah. So again, this is kind of a pressure of interesting.
I mean, the more despotic a society becomes, the more nepotistic it becomes. So at some point, you can only rely on your kin. And if it's a bit more relaxed, then there's also this opportunity to bond with others who are not your kin and start relationships. So for instance, Barbary macaques, we know this, we've studied this also, and others have studied that, is that you can become also a social climber by grooming, or you just have supporters. So these friendships are not only enjoyable because you groom each other and hang out together and know you're not going to be aggressed, but also because they can come to your aid. So there's then room for coalition formation, and so that also plays a role. It's actually, it has substantial advantages if you have friends.
Yeah, when I'm talking, I'm thinking about how our society is organized. It's not that different at all. I mean, of course, there are many details, etc. But if you are also in kind of a stress situation, or you rely on your group more, and if things are easygoing, you start, you're outgoing, you seek for another friendship outside of the group, etc. It's very, very fascinating how this kind of things develop. Millions of years ago, I don't know, but we think it's unique to humans, but actually it's not.
No. We're primates.
Exactly.
So friends and family matter.
Yeah.
And then we have colleagues.
Yeah.
And if we're lucky, they become friends.
Yeah. That is true. I would encourage our listeners to go ahead and purchase your book, Monkeytalk. I started reading it, and it's very, very interesting. You shared a lot more information there about many other interesting experiments of your own and also of others. And you touch upon very interesting topics such as belief in monkeys, how they learn, knowledge, social evolution, if you want, I think, yes. So yes, please guys, go ahead and read up the book. I would like now to go into the last part of our conversation, speaking about science. We briefly touched upon this topic. But towards this kind of the end of the podcast, we want to discuss some of the challenges in academia. And these are most of the time the publishing industry, how it operates, for example, that you kind of wait for a long time. The reviewers are not paid. They're sometimes biased. Then you have the behavior of the journals, and on the other aspect is the reproducibility of experiments. Also, there is kind of this trend that postdocs are leaving academia. They're very well trained PhDs. They decide to leave, which is completely valid. But kind of maybe our field is suffering, and of course there are many others, and these are probably the most prominent to me personally. I would like to ask you about your opinion on some of these aspects, or something else, whatever you decide it's important, and maybe tell us your insight. We as young PhDs, how can we work on certain aspect in order to make it a little bit better?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot going on. As far as I observe the system, so we have very good developments and not so great developments. And I think what is really terrible, how a wonderful idea, namely open access, has completely backfired and created the possibility for the paper mills, and even more forgery. And then the rich get richer. So if you need to pay $6,500 to get a paper published in a high-profile journal, or $11,000, so now you turn it around. So basically, for poor labs or researchers that are not super affluent or not affluent, not living in or researching in affluent countries, they're excluded now at that level. Yeah. So before they couldn't read, now they can't write, which is even worse, actually. Yeah. Or cannot publish. I mean, so I think there needs to be a concerted effort at the government level to dismantle the publishing industry. But of course, they're huge. I mean, they make insane profits, as we all know. The profit margin is crazy. It should be public good. Yeah. So publicly funded research should be considered a public good that is available to everybody, and it needs to be government funded. I mean, there will be still some cost because you need copyright, editors and stuff like this, people who set up, but the costs need to be brought down. And we cannot allow so much research money going into the publishing industry. I think that's a huge problem. Then we need also, I think, a political effort to look at the reward structure and the incentives. And some selectivity in the journals, I think, are necessary. That's clear. But there should also be an incentive for sharing negative results. Yeah. So essentially, the idea of the registered report, I think, is great. So that you say, this is my idea, this is how I plan to do it. And somebody says, okay, if you're going to follow through, we are accepting your paper no matter what the outcome is. So that would be, I think, also is a very good development and should be more frequent. And we know from statistical analysis, so if you do registered reports, since they've been installed, we have far fewer false positives. Yeah, and people are less incentivized to kind of massage the data until they get a significant result and so on. So it does help the integrity and on the reliability of results. So I think there are some good developments, but on the other hand, if you think that now it's only 2%, some people say, but 2% of the papers available out there are completely forged. They are AI produced. So that doesn't make any sense. Yeah, because then other people are busy weeding out this stuff. So we completely have to overhaul, I think, the reward structure. And it cannot be the number of publications. And so that's, I think, we're kind of running into, or we are in a crisis, and it's gonna be bad, really bad.
Yeah, if I can pick up on this, the number of publications, this is complete nonsense because in our research, I can produce data for 3 weeks, and you need years to train the people, right? This is absolute nonsense.
Yeah. So that's one thing. And then the impact factor, as I said, I mean, once you're in a situation where you cannot afford to send a paper to Nature, even though you would love to send it to Nature, because it will not get published, because it's going to be, at some point open access, mandatory open access, and then you have to cough up 11,000 euros. Who has that money? Yeah, and then it's then afterwards they can tell you it's only the Max Planck who produces Nature papers. But so that's insane. So that's certainly one thing we need to look at. The other is, I think we're looking at a more general phenomenon that people are worried about the future, and they are more focusing on the safe haven. So having be sure about what happens. And I think in my time, among the baby boomers, I mean, the job market was horrible. Yeah, so it was really difficult to get a job, but it was so bad that we all went it doesn't matter. So there was no career anyway. And it was more like, okay, if nothing was going to work out, then I can do what I want. And for me, it was like, okay, I'm going to go into science because I love it. And I will do it as long as I can. And if I can't go on, then I will do something different. And it was a bit more carefree. But I just loved it, and doing research was like the best ever. And so that's what I tell my students, as if you love it, and if this is what keeps you going, and you're thinking about while you're riding your bike, it's like, how do I solve this problem? Then just do it. and then you'll do something different, and that's not bad. But if you don't love it, don't do it, because then it's torture for everybody.
Yeah, that's true. That's
for yourself and for anybody who needs to work with you. If you don't, if you're not burning, I don't think you should do science. But the people who burn should do it, because we need it. I mean, we also need people who are trained in science and then go out and do something different, but they know what they're talking about, why this is important, and what the limits of scientific knowledge are, but also what the strength of scientific knowledge are. Because what's the alternative? Everybody has an opinion. Great. I don't want opinion-based decision making. Still a great fan. So
totally true.
So I would. I understand that people want to go into industry, earn more money, but then on the other hand, I don't know. I think if you love science, you should do science. Yeah.
Do you think we've learned actually throughout the podcast many opinions that also throughout our experience, but you have to tolerate uncertainty if you want to stay in academia. This is for sure.
Yeah.
You have to be able to do that. But do you think it's a job of the PI to identify kind of the skills, potential of the PhD student and talk to him or her openly? Hey, I think you carry potential to continue academia. Or in the other case, hey, I think it's better for you to probably pursue career outside of academia.
Let's put it this way. I would probably not try to discourage anybody. But what I like to do is sit down with people and ask them what they want. And normally they know it already. Yeah. And when they say, I'm not sure, and then, we keep on talking, and at some point they say, well, maybe not. And then I say, I think that's a good decision. But there's some where I think they're just amazing. And if they're uncertain, they appear to be uncertain, then I will make sure to let them know that I think that they have a lot of potential and that they should better pursue, go on and get a PhD or, make sure they find a good postdoc. And then I help them to sort of navigate the system if I can. If they ask me, no, there are some people who just they have, I think to be a good scientist, you need many different traits. In addition to being, smart, hopefully, is you need a lot of perseverance. So frustration tolerance. And as you said, uncertainty, you need to, but this is exactly what I teach, at the bachelor level, introduction to scientific thinking and practice and stuff. So it's a bit philosophy of science, and we talk also about career paths. And I said, scientists are where it hurts. We always go to where we are uncertain, because that's where what we are not knowing yet is. So you need to have an affinity to uncertainty, because otherwise you would hate it. If you just want to reconfirm what we already know, that's not moving anything forward. You need to go where it's painful. And so in some sense, I also think, therefore, we had some criteria in the old days, like go to the US or go to France, leave your country, move around. This was always a selection for people who were risk prone. So we're happy to start something new, go into a new environment. And now when we say, but there are good reasons and there are all these personal reasons, and now everybody wants to stay in the same place and stay with the family and not move, so that if it's more parochial, then this is also not good, I think, for science. I think you need to have a certain degree of openness. And of course, when you go to a different country or a different lab and you see how they do the research there, it's very illuminating. And we all need this, change of perspective and the ability to understand that the way we look at the world is one way, and somebody else looks at it, from a different angle, and they have other method skills, and they, But there's also the way, for instance, for me, what was super important as a postdoc, I came from Germany. I did my PhD in Germany, and it was always an issue that I was a woman. Yeah, so I got a lot of this, why do you want to do a PhD? You're a woman. And it's like, what? You don't need a PhD. You're going to have a family. And it's like, and I was, I mean, I wasn't bothered. I was irritated, but I didn't deter me from pursuing my academic interests. But other people maybe would say like, oh, okay, there's no space for me here, in that system. And then I came to the US, and I really had the feeling that they didn't care that I was a woman. It was about whether I had a good question or a good argument, or something to contribute to the debate. So that was the criterion. And so, and for me, that was like, okay, there's another world is possible. Yeah, I think, a lot has changed in the last 2 decades, or 3 since I got my PhD. But when it has really changed for the better, and that's good. So there are still things that we need to fight for and that we can fight for. We can make it better. But so this just staying in one place, I don't think that's a great idea.
Yeah, of course, one should move, explore, experience, learn. This also helps then when you have this multicultural environment in the lab, how to operate, collaborations. This only can benefit you. There is no risk, I think. Of course, you risk dragging your family, or if, this, it is what it is. You have to have a personal conversation, agree on both parties. Okay, let's do it.
It's not easy. There is a cost, but there are also benefits. And I think we're now only talking about the costs, and we should also talk about the benefits. We should also, there are opportunities.
Yes. I totally agree with your point on the thing that where it hurts. And for me, this is probably one of the biggest incentive that we are people who create knowledge. That's it. This is our job. You have to see, it's okay, we know this and this amount of knowledge. Tomorrow we have to know better, more. Because of your work. And this is for me probably the biggest incentive, apart from the multicultural environment and the fact that you want to learn a method and you don't have it in your lab. You call someone, hey, can I come for you to learn this? Yeah, sure. And this can never be in a company. This will never happen, right? Just one thing regarding the publishing industry. I did some research, and I found out that before the Second World War, there was so that the societies, they published actually the science, right? And afterwards, it became kind of hard to maintain. That's why they kind of gave it to the publishing industry. But then with the digitalization, everything went bonkers. So do you think it's a good idea to bring it back to the societies, kind of if they're a part of the governmental establishment, or this is not a good idea?
No, I think that would be a very good idea. Everything is complicated now because the scale is so massive. But basically, putting it back into the hands of the peers, where it belongs, and taking out the profit margins. And I think that would be much better. The benefits would be much higher. Of course, we have all this editorial content now, and then the promotion and all of this. But do we really need that nowadays, especially with the tools and the search engines? And so we can find the information if we want to find it, but I don't need to get glossy letters about, this and that and whatnot. So that would be, I think, my preference, if just to say, okay, we're going back to a model. But I still think we need peer review. On average, I would say the papers benefit greatly from peer review. Of course, some, every now and then you have a review where you go like, oh God, But basically, I would always say it's preferable. And so recently I saw a paper on a preprint server, and the journalists all picked it up and were touting. But I read it and I thought, the claim is not substantiated. There should have been somebody who said, no, this is actually not true. Or we do this thing like we only work with preprint servers, and then you have basically comment sections. But still, I think the round of revisions so far, I would always say, on average, the papers gain in quality. And you take a lot of the bullshitting. You can be removed. Then you have like fancy titles, but the rest of the paper is sort of normal, because the title hasn't been touched. The title still has this. It's not easy, but I think we have to do something, because right now it's absolutely unsustainable. Financially crazy. Even institutions like the German Primate Center are not able to pay. If it goes on like this, we will not be able to sustain publishing in that way.
The funny part is, if I can summarize it in like 1 minute, is that science is funded by the government. Government is funded by the people, taxes, right? So the government decides to distribute this money to institutes, universities, scientists, to buy equipment, to perform experiments. So the scientists do the work, they write the papers. And then you have the journals that have nothing to do with this. However, you pay to them so that they can distribute this kind of articles. And then every person, every institution, every university have to pay also the journal so that they have access to this work. And I don't know, but this is a huge scam, in my opinion.
It is. It's and I think the public doesn't know really. I talked to some family members who are not in academia about the business system. They were like, oh my God, really? And so you work for, you write. So of course, sometimes like I wrote my first articles like, oh, how much money did you make? It's like, no, I'm not making any money. But at least it used to be for free. Now I have to pay to get it published. And or read the paper, depending on where you are or what kind of paper it is. And then you're a reviewer, you're an editor, you don't get paid. So we're doing all the work, and then there is this big conglomerate. And not only do they siphon off your money, all the information as well. I mean, we know this, how whenever you enter your information, where you are, and they're tracking everything. They're tracking every PDF you're downloading. Everything is tracked now. So, and then that information is sold to whoever is interested in it. So we are also providing all of this information for and that's the oil. And it depends on what kind of society you want to live in. I am all for turning this into, it should be community operated and publicly funded.
What should we do as students? So you said government, but this is kind of a top-bottom approach. What can we do as students to raise awareness about this?
I mean, try to support journals that take different routes. So we have in our field, we have one, it's called Animal Behavior and Cognition. It's platinum. So you neither have to pay to read it nor to publish in it, but it doesn't have an impact factor. So we have to be careful, because if I say to a student, okay, you're coming onto the job market, it doesn't have an impact factor, forget it. But in the community, it has a good reputation. So we have to, and there are some initiatives, PeerJ, these kinds of. So the more people, high-powered people, decide to go that route, that I think needs to be the way. And then, of course, everybody is on a selection committee. And the problem there is, of course, if you are, you're sitting in a big panel, and you have an H index that goes through the roof, you think that is the appropriate metric because that's what your metric is. And so we need also, sort of the shaking of the system. But ERC, what they did, they tried to rein in the length of the publication list. So they said you can only submit 10 papers with your application on your publication list, not 400, whatever. And the DFG did the same thing. And what do the reviewers do? They go online and check it.
I mean, at the end, it's human behavior, right?
Exactly.
Whatever we do, it's human behavior. And if you want to change something, we have to change our behavior. That's the point. There's no other
But it's definitely good if, it comes from sort of all sides that this needs to be changed.
All right. So we need to change it, right? We have to do something about it. Professor Fischer, thank you very much once again for your time. I learned a lot about baboons, and I will keep reading your book, even though we heard a lot. And thank you very much for this wonderful insight regarding the academia.
Okay, thank you very much for having me. It was great fun, and keep on pushing this wonderful podcast. It's really great. I'm a great fan.
Thanks.